Welcome to the beginning of our lessons on music theory. You may have done music theory in the past with me. We're going to go right back to the beginning this year, and this will probably be a few years of information to get through to learn everything. So this year, it's this nice, slow, easy start. So the first topic that we're going to cover when it comes to music theory is things that have to do with elements of pitch. So let's jump in. So the keyboard and octave ranges. So pitch in music refers to the highness or lowness of a sound. Pitches are named by using the first 7 letters of the alphabet: A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. We will approach the notation of pitch by relating this pitch alphabet to the keyboard. So those letters will be translated onto the piano keyboard, using C's as an example, as we see here. The C nearest the middle of the keyboard is called middle C, or C4. Higher C's, that's moving toward the right-hand side of the keyboard, are named C5, C6, and so on. Lower C's, moving towards the left of the keyboard, are named C3, C2, and C1. Below C1 are followed by zeros, as in B0 and A0. Those are the ones down there. All the C's on the piano are labeled in the example that you can see. So you can see here C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, and C8. From any C up or down to the next C is called an octave. All the pitches from one C up to, but not including the next C, are said to be in the same octave register. As we see here, the white keys above C4 would be named D4 because it is in the same octave register. But the white key below C4 would be named B3 because it is in the lower octave register. When it comes to notation on the SAF, our system of musical notation is similar to a graph in which time is indicated on the x-axis and pitch is shown on the y-axis. We can see here R occurs before S in time, and it is higher than S in pitch. The staff is used in music to indicate the precise pitch desired. A staff consists of 5 lines and 4 spaces, but it may be extended indefinitely through the use of ledger lines. Here we see 3 ledger lines above and 3 ledger lines below the staff of 5 lines. A clef must appear at the beginning of the staff in order to indicate which pitches are to be associated with which lines and spaces. The 3 different clefs commonly used today are shown here, and the position of C4 in each is illustrated. Notice that the C clef appears in either of 2 positions. So our first clef here is a treble clef. And if you notice that little curly bit down on the end, it circles right around a line. The second line up, that line is G. Because this specifies where G is, this is also known as G clef. Notice that if you started from that G and counted each space and line with letters, we would go from G, F, E on the bottom line, D below that, and then finally C4 on that first ledger line. Next, we have a bass clef, also known as F clef, because if you look at those 2 little dots beside the bass clef, they are on either side of F. Now, if we were to start from that F and go up, we would go F, G, A in the first line, top line, B, and then C. That's also our C4. The next two clefs look very similar. They sort of look like vertical lines with two backward C's. Sometimes they get illustrated more like K's. That middle place where they meet, that is signifying middle C. So on the first one, this is alto clef, and it shows us that middle C is on the middle line. The next one we see beside it is tenor clef, and it shows us that middle C is on the second line from the top. These clefs are shown in the positions that are in common use today, but you may occasionally find them placed differently on the staff in some editions. Wherever they appear, the design of the G clef circling G4, the dots of the F clef surrounding F3, and the C clef is centered on C4. The grand staff is a combination of two staves joined by a brace, with the top and bottom staves using treble and bass clefs, respectively. Various pitches are notated and labeled on the grand staff as we see here. Pay special attention to the way in which ledger lines are used on the grand staff. For instance, the notes C4 and A3 appear twice in this example, once in relation to the top staff and once in relation to the bottom staff. Take a few moments now to complete the questions in 1-1. Continuing on, the major scale. Here you will learn about major and minor scales, the scales that form the basis of tonal music. However, there are many other types of scales, some of which will be covered much later on. The major scale is a specific pattern of small steps, called half steps, and large ones, called whole steps, encompassing an octave. A half step is the distance from a key on the piano to the very next key, white or black. So you see here they illustrate E to F and B to C. But if we were to go from E down to that black note above it, that would be E to E flat. That would also be a half step. So the half steps are between every single note, not just the big white ones. Using only the white keys on the piano keyboard, there are two half steps in each octave. So we have that there in the example as well. A whole step skips the very next key and goes instead to the following one. Using only the white keys on the keyboard, there are 5 whole steps in each octave. So here you see C to D, a whole step, D to E, a whole step. In the previous example, E to F, a half step, F to G, a whole step, G to A, whole step, A to B, whole step, B to C, back to the previous one was a half step. The major scale pattern of whole and half steps is the same as that found on the white keys from any C up to the next C. In the next diagram, the numbers with carets above them, those are the little hats, are scale degree numbers for the C major scale. You can see from this diagram that half steps in the major scale occur only between scale degree 3, 4, and 7 and 1. So when we put those hats above the numbers, that is telling us scale degree. The letters do not matter. Notice also that the major scale can be thought of as two identical 4-note patterns separated by a whole step. These 4-note patterns are called tetrachords. So here we have C, D, E, F. So that's a whole half. Then there's G, A, B, C, whole half, with the difference between F and G being that whole step. If we examine the steps on the white keys of a G to G octave, as in the example, we do not find the same pattern of whole and half steps that occur in the C to C octave. In order to play a G major scale, we would need to skip the F key and play the black key that is between F and G. We will label that key with an accidental, that is, a symbol that raises or lowers a pitch by a half or whole step. All the possible accidentals are here. So we have a double sharp, which is notated with an X. That raises a note a whole step. There is a sharp, which looks like the hashtag symbol, and that raises the note a half step. There is a natural sign, which there's not really anything else that we draw that looks like that, and it cancels a previous accidental. Then there's the flat, which kind of looks like a lowercase b, and that lowers the note a half step. And then there's the double flat, which is just two flat symbols beside each other, and that lowers the note a whole step. So we can make our G scale conform to the major scale pattern by adding one accidental, in this case a sharp. So we want to see that same pattern that we saw in C of whole, whole, half, a whole break, and then whole, whole, half. Without having that F sharp, we have whole, whole, half, break, whole, half, whole. So we need to raise that F to make sure that it fits in. It is important to understand that major and minor scales always use all the letter names of the musical alphabet. It would not be correct to substitute G flat for the F sharp in a G major scale. So you want to have everything. If you were to start on B, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B with accidentals in there, but you will always have all the letters. So notice that when we write or say the names of notes and accidentals, we put the accidental last, as in F sharp. But in staff notation, the accidental always precedes the note that it modifies, as we can see in this example. This is so that when we're reading, we read the modification first before we play the note. However, when we communicate it, we communicate the alteration afterwards. The major key signatures. So one way to learn the major scales is by means of the pattern of whole and half steps discussed previously. Another is by memorizing the key signatures associated with the various scales. The term key is used in music to identify the first degree of a scale. For instance, the key of G major refers to the major scale that begins on G. A key signature is a pattern of sharps or flats that appears at the beginning of a staff and indicates that certain notes are to be consistently raised or lowered. There are 7 key signatures using sharps. In each case, the number of the major key can be found by going up a half step from the last sharp. So we see here a number of different key signatures that have sharps in their key signature. For G major, our last sharp is an F sharp, so if we go up a semitone, that takes us to G. In D major, our last sharp is C sharp, so we go up a semitone, that takes us to D. So on and so forth. If we want to go all the way to C sharp major, our last sharp is a B sharp, which is actually the same note as C, which I'm sure we'll cover later on. So we have to raise that, and that brings us to C sharp. There are also 7 key signatures using flats. Except for the key of F major, the name of the major key is the same as the name of the next to last flat. So we can see here F major, like they said, this trick doesn't work there. You just have to remember that F major has 1 flat. But if we look at B flat major, you go to the second to last flat, which is a B flat. Tells you you're in B flat major. E flat major, We go to our second to last flat, and that's an E flat major, so on and so forth, until we get all the way down to the end for C flat major. Our last flat is a F flat, and the one before that is a C flat. You may have noticed that there are 3 pairs of major keys that would sound exactly the same. That is, they would be played on the very same keys of the piano keyboard. They are B major and C flat major, F sharp major and G flat major, and C sharp major and D flat major. Notes that are spelled differently but sound the same are said to be enharmonic. So B major and C flat major, for example, are enharmonic keys. If 2 major keys are not enharmonic, then they are transpositions of each other. To transpose means to write or play music in some key other than the original. The key signatures that we've seen so far must be memorized, not only by the number of accidentals involved, but also their order and placement on the staff. Notice that the pattern of placing the sharps on the staff changes at the 5th sharp for both the treble and bass clefs. Try saying aloud the order of accidentals for sharps: F, C, G, D, A, E, B. And for flats: B, E, A, D, G, C, F, until you feel confident with them. Another way to remember them is to use a pneumatic device. So for our sharps, F, C, G, D, A, E, B, we can think of Father Charles goes down and ends battle. Then for our flats, it's the reverse. Battle ends and down goes Charles' father. Key signatures are written in much the same way using the alto and tenor clef as are for treble and bass. The only exception is the placement of sharps in the tenor clef, as you can see here in this example. Some people find it easier to memorize key signatures if they visualize a circle of fifths, which is a diagram somewhat like the face of a clock. Reading clockwise around the circle of fifths, you will see that each new key begins on 5, or the 5th scale degree of the previous key. So if we start at the top, we go C, C, D, E, F, G, G, A, B, C, D, D, E, F, G, A, and so on and so forth. At this point, could you please go over to Forms and fill out checkpoint 1, and then complete the questions in section 1-2. Continuing on, minor scales. Musicians traditionally practice and memorize 3 minor scale formations, although these are simplifications of how minor keys actually work, as we will see later on. One of these is the natural minor scale. You can see from the illustration that the natural minor scale is like a major scale, with a lowered 3rd, 6th, and 7th scale degree. So here we see our C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and our C natural minor being C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C. Another minor scale type is the harmonic minor scale, which can be thought of as a major with a lowered 3 and 6. So here in our C harmonic minor scale, we go C, D, E flat, like the natural, F, G, A flat, also like the natural, but here the B is not flatted. third type of minor scale is the melodic minor scale, which has an ascending form and a descending form. Ascending meaning going up and descending meaning going down. The ascending form, shown here, is like a major with only a lowered third. So we have C, D, E flat, like the natural and the harmonic, and then the rest is like our major scale. The descending form of the melodic minor scale is the same as the natural minor scale. The three minor scale types are summarized here. The scale degree that differ from the major scale are circled, and please notice the arrows used in connection with the melodic minor scale in order to distinguish the descending 6/7 from the ascending 6/7. Minor key signatures. Minor key signatures conform to the natural minor scale no matter which minor scale type is actually in use. Looking back at the previous example, you can see that the natural minor scale on C requires three accidentals, B flat, E flat, and A flat. The key signature of C minor, then, is the same as the key signature for E flat major. C minor and E flat major are said to be relatives because they share the same key signature. We call them relatives. The third scale degree of any minor key is the first scale degree of its relative major. And the sixth scale degree of any major key is the first scale degree of its relative minor. If a major scale and a minor scale share the same one, as do C major and C minor, for example, they are said to be parallel. We would say that C major is the parallel minor to C minor. The circle of fifths is a convenient way to display the names of the minor keys and the relative majors as well as their key signatures. In this diagram, the names of the minor keys are in lowercase, as usual, and they are inside the diagram. So this might be also a good time to point out that when we're using letters for major keys, we use uppercase letters, and we use letters for minor keys. They're lowercase letters. You may find it easier to learn the minor scales in terms of their relative majors, as in the circle of fifths diagram, instead of the terms of the parallel majors, which is how minor scales are introduced. This will be most helpful regarding the keys of G sharp, D sharp, and A sharp, which have no parallel major form. If you do use the relative major approach, remember that the key signature for any minor scale conforms to the natural minor scale, and that accidentals must be used in order to spell the other forms. Specifically, you have to raise the seventh scale degree of the natural minor scale to produce the harmonic minor scale, and raise 6 and 7 of the natural minor scale to get the ascending form of the melodic minor scale. This example illustrates the spelling for the related keys of F major and D minor. So first we have our F major scale. Then we have its relative minor. So that is the same key signature, but the minor form. So in this case, it starts on D. Then the natural form becomes the harmonic form, where we raise the seventh. Finally, the melodic form, where we raise the sixth and the seventh on the way up, but lower them on the way down. One final hint. A quick way to find any minor key signature other than G sharp, D sharp, and A sharp is to begin with the key signature of the parallel major and to add 3 flats, or to subtract 3 sharps. So, we can see here that the key of B flat major has 2 flats. So if we add 3 flats to that, we would have 5 flats and it would become B flat minor. For E major, it has 4 sharps in its key signature. So instead of adding flats, we take away sharps. So we remove 3 sharps, leaving us with 1 sharp, and that would be our E minor. We can also see D here. It is very important to practice faithfully all the major and minor scales on an instrument until they become memorized patterns. An intellectual understanding of scales cannot substitute for the secure tactile and oral familiarity that will result from those hours of practice. Please take the time now to work on exercise 1-3. Scale degree names. Musicians in conversation or in writing often refer to scale degrees by a set of traditional names rather than by numbers. The names are shown here. Notice that there are 2 names for 7 in minor, depending on whether it is raised. So, our first scale degree is the tonic. Above that, degree 2, the supertonic. Degree 3, the mediant. Degree 4, the subdominant. Degree 5, the dominant. Degree 6, the submediant. In degree 7, we notice that if it's that flat inversion of 7 in the natural minor, it is the subtonic. Whereas if it's in major or in harmonic or melodic where it's been raised, we refer to that 7th scale degree as the leading tone. The origin of some of these names is illustrated here. Notice that the mediant lies halfway between the tonic and the dominant, while the submediant lies halfway between the tonic and the subdominant. Please now do checkpoint 2 before coming back. Continuing on, intervals. An interval is the measurement of the distance in pitch between 2 notes. A harmonic interval results if the notes are performed at the same time, whereas a melodic interval occurs when the notes are played successively, as we can see here. The method of measuring intervals is the same for both harmonic and melodic intervals. So here we have the harmonic interval of A to E and of F to A. Then we have the melodic intervals of E to A to F, and then F to A. There are 2 parts to any interval name: the numerical name and the modifier that precedes the numerical name. As in this example, the numerical name is a measurement of how far apart the notes are vertically on the staff, regardless of what accidentals are involved. So when they're on the same line, it's a 1 or same space. 2 is 2 adjoining lines or spaces. So we see that there, A and B, C and D. A third is 1 space to the next space or 1 line to the next line. A fourth is a little bit further apart as well. In talking about intervals, we use the terms unison instead of 1 and octave or an 8VE instead of 8. We also say second instead of 2 and third instead of 3 and so on. Intervals smaller than an octave are called simple intervals, whereas larger intervals, including the octave, are called compound intervals. It is important to notice that in this example that the harmonic interval of a second is notated with the top note offset a little bit to the right of the bottom note. Accidentals are offset in the same way for harmonic intervals of a second, third, or fourth if both of them require an accidental. Please take a break and do questions 1-4. Continuing on, perfect, major, and minor intervals. One way to begin learning the modifiers for intervals is by relating them to the intervals contained in the major scale, specifically the intervals from 1 up to the other scale degrees. This method can then be applied in any context, whether or not the major scale is actually being used. The term perfect, which we abbreviate with a P, is a modifier used only in connection with unisons, fourths, fifths, octaves, and their compounds, such as elevenths, and so on. In this example, a perfect first, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and perfect octave can all be constructed by using 1 in the major scale as the bottom note. If we want to spell one of these intervals above E flat, for example, we need only to think of scale steps 1, 4, and 5 of the E flat major scale. If the bottom note does not commonly serve as a first scale degree of a major scale, such as a D sharp, remove that accidental temporarily, spell the interval, and then apply the accidentals to both sides, as we can see here. So, if we start with our D sharp, and we want a perfect fifth above, if we think of D, we know that a perfect fifth above D would be A, so therefore, a perfect fifth above D sharp would be A sharp. The modifiers major and minor are used only in connection with seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. The intervals formed by scale degree 1 to 2, scale degree 1 to 3, scale degree 1 to 6, and scale degree 1 to 7 in the major scale are all major intervals, as we can see here. So 1 to 2 is a major second, 1 to 3 is a major third, 1 to 6 is a major sixth, 1 to 7 is a major 7 in the major scale. If a major interval is made a half step smaller without altering its numerical name, it becomes a minor interval. Notice that you can make an interval smaller by lowering the top note or raising the bottom note. So here we have G to A being a major second, and then G to A flat being a minor second. F to A being a major third, F sharp to A being a minor third. We can see those all right here. Now, please take a moment to complete questions 1-5. Continuing on, augmented and diminished intervals. If a perfect or a major interval is made a half step larger without changing the numerical name, the interval becomes augmented, which we abbreviate with a plus sign. If a perfect or a minor interval is made a half step smaller without changing its numerical name, it becomes diminished, abbreviated with like a degree symbol. The relationships are summarized here. So, If you have a major interval that gets raised, it becomes augmented. If you have a major interval that gets made smaller, it becomes minor. If you have a minor interval that becomes bigger, it becomes major. If you have a minor interval that becomes smaller, it becomes diminished. Perfect intervals can only become augmented or diminished. They cannot be major or minor. So if you raise a perfect interval, it's augmented, and if you lower a perfect interval, it is diminished. Also, if you lower an augmented interval, it becomes major if it's a 2, 3, 6, or 7. There is no such thing as a diminished unison. Doubly augmented and doubly diminished intervals are possible, but they seldom occur. Tritone is a term used for the augmented fourth or its enharmonic equivalent, the diminished fifth. The tritone is said to be one of the most unstable sounds in music, and it has been linked to the devil in history. What do you think? Inversion of intervals. Descending intervals, especially large ones, are often easier to spell and identify through the use of interval inversion. We invert an interval by putting the bottom pitch above the top one. For example, the interval D to A inverts to A to D. When we invert an interval, the new numerical name is always different from the old one. The new numerical name can be calculated by subtracting the old numerical name from 9. So, we can see here that if we take 9 and the old numerical name was a second, we remove that, and now it becomes a seventh. 9 minus a third is a sixth, so the interval inversion for 3 is 6. Our interval inversion for 4 is 5, and then it's the reverse for all those. 5 becomes 4, 6 becomes 3, and 7 becomes 2. You can see that an inverted second becomes a seventh, and a third becomes a sixth, and so on in this example as well. The modifier also changes when an interval is inverted, with the exception of perfect intervals. So, if the first interval was minor, the next interval would be major, or the inverted interval would be major. Vice versa is the same. If the first interval was major, the inversion is minor. Perfect stays the same. Augmented becomes diminished. Diminished becomes augmented. As an example of the usefulness of inversion, suppose you want to know what note lies a minor sixth above G3. Invert the minor sixth down to a major third up. As we can see here in this example, we transpose the B3 down the octave, and you'll find a B2 is the answer. Fluency with intervals, as with scales, is necessary for any serious musician and will provide a solid foundation for your further study. As you did with scales, you will benefit from finding out how various intervals sound and feel on a musical instrument. One exercise you can do, or that you can think of others, of course, is to write out the notes of the chromatic scale in random order. Include each black key twice, once as a sharp note and once as a flat note. Then play some interval above and below each note. Work for speed, using your ear to correct yourself. Consonant and dissonant intervals. In tonal music, some harmonic intervals are considered to be consonant, whereas others are considered to be dissonant. The terms consonant and dissonant can be defined roughly as meaning pleasing to the ear and not pleasing to the ear, respectively, but these are very dependent on context. Some of the most exciting moments in tonal music involve dissonance, which is certainly not displeasing in that context, but the dissonance resolves eventually to the consonants that give them meaning. If you can imagine, this is a complex subject, and it is one with which much study we will do later on. For now, it will suffice to say that major and minor thirds and sixths and perfect fifths and eighths are consonant. All other intervals are dissonant, except for the perfect fourth, which is dissonant only when it occurs above the lowest note, also called the bass, even in instrumental music. Please take a moment to do checkpoint 3, and when you are finished checkpoint 3, complete questions 1-6. Continuing on. Summary. Pitch in music refers to the highness or lowness of a sound. Particular pitches are named by using the musical alphabet, consisting of the letters A through G, at which point the alphabet starts over. From one letter up or down to its next occurrence is called an octave, whereas the space from any C up to the next B is called an octave register. Octave registers are numbered, with the lowest C on the piano keyboard designated as 1. The C nearest the middle of the piano keyboard is called middle C, or C4. Pitches are notated on the staff, an arrangement of 5 lines and 4 spaces that can be extended through the use of ledger lines. A staff always begins with one of several clefs, which determine exactly what pitch is represented by each line or space. A grand staff consists of 2 staves joined by a brace, with a treble clef on the top staff and a bass clef on the bottom. A major scale consists of 2 identical tetrachords that have a particular arrangement of whole steps and half steps. Most major scales also have a parallel minor scale that begins on the same note, but that lowers scales degrees 3, 6, and 7 by a half step. This form of the minor is called the natural minor scale. The harmonic minor scale lowers only scale degree 3 and 6 of its parallel major, whereas the melodic minor scale lowers scale degree 3 when ascending and scale degrees 3, 6, and 7 when descending. Every scale has an associated key signature consisting of 0 to 7 sharps or flats arranged in a particular way on the staff. There are 15 key signatures in all, with 1 major and 1 minor scale associated with each. Major and minor keys that share the same key signature are said to be relative keys, whereas those that share the same starting note are said to be parallel keys. The notes of a scale are all assigned scale degree names, which vary only slightly between major and minor. Enharmonic notes or keys sound the same but are spelled differently. To transpose music means to play it in another key. The difference between any 2 pitches is called an interval. A harmonic interval separates pitches and are sounded simultaneously, whereas a melodic individual separates pitches that are sounded in succession. Intervals are defined by means of a numerical name and a modifier that precedes it. These modifiers include the terms perfect, major, minor, augmented, and diminished. To invert an interval, put the lower note above the upper one, or the reverse. The numerical name and modifier of an inverted interval can be predicted using the method explained, where minor becomes major, diminished becomes augmented, and perfect stays the same. Also, you subtract the original interval from 9 to get the new interval. Consonant intervals include major and minor thirds and sixths, the perfect fifth, and the perfect eighth, or octave. The perfect fourth is usually consonant unless it occurs above the lowest voice.